I should start right at 2.
You start right at 2, yeah. I'll send you a little text. Hold on. Okay, everyone, we're about to go live now. I'm gonna hit the button.
Good afternoon. My name is Stefan Lallinger. I'm a fellow at the Century Foundation and the director of the Bridges Collaborative. Thank you for joining us for this panel, To Screen or Not to Screen, New York City Public School Admissions and COVID-19, presented by the Century Foundation's Bridges Collaborative. Today, we'll discuss concrete policy solutions for the short and long term as it relates to the admissions policies of screen schools in the New York City Department of Education. We'll begin with a 30-minute discussion followed by Q&A. Please submit Q&A in the chat box, the Q&A chat box for those of you who are joining us via Zoom. Also, a recording of this will be made available on our website within 48 hours, tcf.org. On our panel today is Sean P. Corcoran, Associate Professor of Public Policy and Education at Vanderbilt University, Brandon St. Luce, a student at Edward R. Murrow and the Co-Director of Policy for Teens Take Charge, Lynn Shawn, a teacher at MS 88, located in District 15 in the New York City Department of Education, and Nadia Chada, a Senior Director of Strategic Affairs in the Office of Student Enrollment at the New York City DOE. Nadia will not be a panelist today, but will serve as someone giving us information and answers to factual questions about the way screens work in the New York City Department of Education. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the things happening in our country. First, we're in the midst of a pandemic, the likes of which many of us have never seen. Our friends, neighbors, and family members have gotten ill, lost jobs, and passed away. I would like to take a brief moment of silence to acknowledge the victims of this crisis. We are also in the midst of national tumult sparked by the murder of George Floyd, a peace-loving man. His death triggered painful memories for those of us who have been mistreated by the police. It also sparked outrage, not just among Black Americans, but Americans of all colors and persuasions. What we are seeing across the nation today, and have seen over the last few days, is a result of the long and painful legacy of racism, bigotry, and violence perpetrated against Black people in this country by the police and the government at large, dating back to our nation's founding. Our inability to confront and remediate these injustices has led us to the present moment. Before we talk about the topic at hand, a topic that is so important to the future of our young people in New York City, I want to offer each of the panelists the opportunity to open by briefly talking about how the events of the past week have impacted them. Dr. Corcoran, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Stefan, and thanks also to the Century Foundation for organizing this important event. Let me just first acknowledge that I'm speaking from a position of privilege as a white male living in the United States. I also wanted to draw attention to my Zoom background behind me, which is a photo that I took from NYU's Kimmel Center of a Black Lives Matter protest in Washington Square Park in December 2014. It's a reminder that things have not gotten better in this country for Americans of color who are routinely facing discrimination at the hands of police. The images I'm seeing this week from all over the country are heartbreaking, and I'm standing firmly behind those who have braved the pandemic to peacefully protest injustice. And to bring this back to education and schools, we need significant change in this country, and education is what will get us there.
Thank you, Dr. Corcoran. I'm going to go now to Brandon St. Luce.
Sorry, I was still muted. Thank you for inviting me. I want to start by saying that and understanding the importance of student voice when discussing schools and student well-being as a whole. Just quickly, I want to say that the events that took place on Monday personally horrified me, to say the least, and definitely took a toll on me mentally as well as they have on my friends. Watching the public execution of a man that could easily have been my father or myself in the future was a major shock to my system, and these public lynchings have happened much too frequently and need to stop. I don't know if the current strategy that's being used in American streets all around the country right now are the best ways to go about things, but I know that many of the peaceful protests that have been going on for over a century are not working and have not worked. I hope a change is actually coming, but I can promise that it will not without white moderates showing that they also care about these issues, as MLK, who many love to quote, has also admitted to himself and in his writing. It's gotten to the point where my friends are no longer fazed by these executions of men who look so similar to them because they're so used to it and have numbed the pain for themselves. And this is obviously really unacceptable.
Thank you, Brandon. And we're going to go now to Lynn Sean.
Hi, everyone. I also want to echo what Brandon said. Thank you so much for including me as a teacher in New York City schools, Stefan and Century Foundation. I kind of, in light of recent events, I've been thinking a lot about how did we get here? And as educators, how did we cultivate these deeply internalized racial biases that can ultimately lead to such violent acts? And as a teacher, I've actually been thinking a lot about Amy Cooper specifically because there is a spectrum of racial violence, and Amy kind of reads as someone who's more familiar and more innocuous to us. And I think about what her classroom looked like when she was a child. Who did she learn from? Who did she learn alongside? What books did she read? Who, if anyone, ever challenged her perspectives? And I think it's really important not to isolate her acts from the outwardly violent and murder of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin. It's too easy to direct our rage on these individuals, but they are a product of a system, and education is a big part of that system. And we have an opportunity before us, given the COVID crisis, and critically examining policies and disrupting those policies to save lives. And I say this because racial segregation played a tremendous role in cultivating these deeply internalized racial biases. And as a teacher at a diverse school, I know that racial diversity can actively fight that. Racial tension in the classroom is productive, it's empowering. But if that's shielded from our children, racial tension then manifests as violence in the world. So yes, I move forward thinking about how does racial segregation perpetuate racial violence, and what is the role of screens in that?
Thank you to all of the panelists for starting on such a deeply personal note. I know it's not an easy topic to begin with, a somber note, but it's certainly something that all of us are thinking about right now and have been thinking about for the past few days. We're going to turn our attention to the issue of screens, and how I'd like to start is I'd like each of the panelists very briefly to tell us what is your relationship with screens? What is your experience with screens? And we'll take the same order for this question. We'll start with you, Sean, and then we'll go to Brandon and to Lynn.
Thanks, Stefan. So I'm currently a professor of public policy and education at Vanderbilt, but prior to moving to Vanderbilt, I was on the faculty of NYU Steinhardt School for 13 years. And a central focus of my research was the high school admissions process in New York City. So my interest in screens has been primarily on the research side. So I'm interested in questions such as, what does the use of screens mean for efficiency and for equity in public education? What educational purposes do screens serve? To what extent do screens promote segregation or limit access to high-performing schools? And how do screens affect the allocation of resources across students and across schools? So I'm interested in screens as a researcher, but I'm also someone who cares deeply about public education and its role in creating opportunities for all students. I should also mention I'm part of a subcommittee or a task force that was organized by the Furek Center for Social Justice at the Fordham Law School. We recently published some guidelines and recommendations for high school admissions next year. So I've been following this very, very closely, even from my position here in Nashville.
Thank you. Brandon? As a student who's gone through the public education system my whole life, I've had firsthand experience with screens. I've gone to an elementary school that was majority white, to a middle school that was majority Black and Latinx, and then to my current high school, Murrow, which is the most diverse school in the city. And so I've really been able to see the effects that screens have had, even when going to a school where everyone looks like me and going to school where nobody really looks like me, and the conversations that are had in the classroom. And so I've also been able to, now that I'm at Murrow, when I'm having those conversations and when I'm in any class, I'm able to see the positive effects that screens have on myself. And when I'm reaching out to many of my friends who went to past schools that I'm still connecting with, their experiences are so blatantly different than mine in the school system, even though we are in the exact same system. It kind of shocked me, and that really got me very interested in the work. So I'm interested from a personal standpoint, but also just trying to make it better for future generations after I graduate when we move on.
Great. Thank you, Brandon. Lynn, you want to get in here?
Sure. So my connection to screens, I'm a teacher in District 15. I've been at Middle School 88 for my entire teaching career. This is my 10th year. And MS 88 has historically been a relatively diverse school, middle school in the district. But recently, as a consequence of the District 15 diversity plan, which completely eliminated middle school screens, our school is even more diverse. And for us, that means more white. And so, you know, prior to the implementation of this policy, with the policy was also a whole entire section on inclusion, which is about culturally responsive pedagogy, diverse teaching force, and all that. I don't want to separate those because they're critical to work in concert, but I want to talk specifically about how a diverse changing student body changes the other policies and curricula and the pedagogy that's happening internally in a school. So for example, as a school, we never had an equity team, and the implementation of that plan really did empower me personally to feel like I could lead the equity work. And it was happening in pockets in the school, but now we've kind of come together in solidarity and for Black Lives Matter. And we are actively doing the anti-racist work through group study. We read together, we write together, we disagree. The same kind of racial tension that we see among our students, which is really important and productive. And fighting racism and dismantling it happens among the adults. And there's a lot being said that, you know, if we just remove screens, then what's going to happen? You know, our schools are not going to be prepared. Well, I don't believe schools will ever be prepared for this. We've never really done this before in New York City schools, or at least for a significant amount of time to see it through. And it's going to be hard, and it has been really hard. But I can speak to some of those changes, and the equity team is one example of that, and seeing how that's now permeated, the adult work has permeated in our libraries, in the project students work on. And I can name a million things, but I do believe that when your student body changes, everything will also change. It must change in response to the students that we're serving. And you know, another relevant example right now is our PTA. Our PTA raised over $21,000 in a very short amount of time in response to COVID, specifically to redistribute resources to our most vulnerable families. And $21,000 for MS 88 is a lot of money. I've not in my 10 years at 88 seen our PTA raise this much money in such a short amount of time. And that was really, really important in our community resilience. And, you know, I believe that, you know, it did not come from false charity. It was really because these are our children. And when your children go to school with, you know, what you would have said before, those children, they are our children. And it takes a long time to see it that way, but until your children are learning alongside and exchanging knowledge and culture day in and day out, we're depriving all of ourselves from that resilience.
That's a really beautiful connection to the COVID crisis, Lynn. Thank you for that. So on our panel, we've got a professor who studied these issues intimately, and we've got a student, and we've got a teacher. So we've got the perfect mix of folks to talk about this. And Lynn comes from District 15, which we'll mention. We're going to come back to District 15 a little bit further in our conversation for the reason that Lynn gave, that they eliminated their middle school screens. And so we want to talk a little bit about how that went. We're also going to pose the question to our panelists about how they would advise the mayor and the chancellor right now about what to do for next year. So we're going to get to that. But I want to start by actually bringing in Nadia Chadha, who is our representative from the Department of Education. She works in the Office of Student Enrollment. And again, we're not asking her for her opinions, but I'm going to do sort of a lightning round with you, Nadia, where I'm going to ask you some basic questions about screens. I'm going to ask you to answer as quickly and succinctly as you can. But this is just to make sure all of us are operating from the same information. So Nadia, let's turn to you. And I'd like you to answer first. what are screens and what are the most common types of screens that exist in New York City?
Hi, Stefan. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. So screen schools are essentially schools that select students for admission. So they review information about students to calculate a rank for that student, and kids are usually matched into these schools in order of that rank. And the way they calculate that rank most often is by looking at students' academic records. So they look at students' grades, test scores, and attendance records to calculate this rank. Many schools also use additional metrics such as auditions, interviews, or other school-based assessments to add more nuance to their ranking process.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So really quickly, when in a student's career are they applying for these schools? And can you, and in addition, can you tell us what the process looks like for a student who hopes to get accepted to a screen school?
Yeah, definitely. So screen schools exist at every level, but in this conversation, we're primarily talking about middle school and high school. So kids would participate in this process in their 5th and 8th grade years for admission the following year. And really, in the simplest case of a screen school, they would just need to list the school on their application and submit the application, and that's that. But given the fact that so many schools screen in different ways, there are many cases where families have to do additional research, like understand whether there's additional requirements like interviews at the school. They may have to sign up for open houses or submit a portfolio in person. And a lot of this information is kept in different places. So sometimes it can be as simple as putting it on an application, and sometimes it's doing a lot of additional research to navigate how to apply to that school.
That's great. So, you know, when a lot of us think of screen schools, we think schools are just trying to get the highest caliber applicants they can based on standardized test scores. Is that how most screen schools work, or are there other unique models or ways of using screens that schools in the DOE use?
Yeah, I think screens can mean a lot of things. So one way that screens take on more of a inclusive approach is dual language programs, where screens actually try to match a range of multilingual speakers to a program. One popular model that exists at the high school level is something called educational option. And this is a model where the school is essentially trying to match in a diverse, academically diverse pool of applicants. So the goal is to reserve a percentage of seats for high performers, for middle performers, and low performers, so that ultimately the students who attend the school represent a range of backgrounds. And we also have a lot of screen schools that participate in a program called Diversity in Admissions, which we'll talk about a bit more when we talk about District 15. But what these schools do is, even though they have a screen, they prioritize a portion of their seats for underrepresented students. And that can mean low-income students, students in temporary housing, English language learners, or students from underrepresented geographic areas. And that's a way to maintain the screen, but also make sure that the school is serving a broader range of students. That also usually means that the kids are more academically diverse.
It's very helpful. Who decides if a school is screened or not? Is that something made centrally? Does the chancellor pick and choose? I mean, how do these things get decided?
$1 million question. So the screen schools that exist in our system now have been around for many years, and I think there's probably people who are watching this panel, or even Sean, who can speak better than me to the history of these programs. In my experience, they've been around for many years, if not decades. Under Mayor de Blasio, as a matter of practice, the DOE hasn't opened new screen programs or schools, and that's not really an option that we currently offer to schools if they're opening new programs.
All right, last question, then we're going to go back to our panel. About how many screen schools exist in New York City, and roughly how many students do they serve?
Yeah, great question. There are about 200 middle schools and 125 high schools that use some sort of screen for like a portion of their seats or all of their seats. And that's about a third of our middle and high schools overall. They each serve about, I would say, close to 45,000 students overall.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. So I'm going to flip back to our panel here. Dr. Corcoran, what is the purpose of screening students in the school system? What ends does it serve? And what is the outcome?
Thanks, Stefan. So as Nadia said, screens in New York mean a lot of different things. And so it's it's never appropriate really to talk about screens as sort of one type of school. And that's actually part of the problem that we can probably come back to later in the conversation. But I'd say there's multiple explanations for screens in New York as well as other cities. One is really just history and path dependence. So as Nadia alluded to, many of these screen schools and programs have been around for decades. The fraction of students who are attending screen schools is roughly about the same as it was about 20 years ago. It's gone up maybe a little bit, but it's been relatively stable. And New York City, for those that know the city's history, is just a patchwork quilt of borough and community school district systems with power that historically is alternated between this central office and local schools and districts. And so many of the screen programs that are there are simply there by historical accident, I guess. And many schools and families would like to hold on to a system that has worked well for them for generations. So a lot of it's about path dependence. Another is just acknowledging the very real achievement gap that exists between students in New York City when they come to high school. And properly serving all students requires some attention to where students are starting from when they enter high school. And screening programs in schools are one way to do that. Not necessarily the best way to do that, but it's one way to address that. So it's a version of tracking, really, in which tracking is happening between schools rather than within schools. And most Americans around the country who have attended high school or familiar with tracking in some form. In New York, I would say a lot of that happens between schools through these screening programs. A third rationale I'd say is assessing interest. So many of these specialized screen high schools are specialized in some sort of field of study, whether that's STEM or medical professions or arts. And schools at the very least want some kind of assurance that students are a good fit for the program, that this is something that they're actually motivated to study. So that's another use of screens. And then lastly, I would point to screening as sort of a policy to retain the middle class in the city. So historically, large cities have turned to screening type arrangements to respond to the needs or demands of families that might otherwise leave the city. The evidence on that, I think, is not particularly strong, but that's certainly an argument that's made very frequently about screens. So you also asked about outcomes, and I'll speak really briefly to that. One, I mean, there's been really no real assessment of whether screens are working for students in the sense of producing better outcomes for all students. It's a hard thing to assess, but I can point to no evidence in New York that's really looked at whether screens are working in that sense. There is some research on the specialized high schools, Stuyvesant, Brooklyn Tech, Bronx Science, that generally finds that these very highly selective schools are not making students any better off. They're not any worse off, but these are students that would do exceptionally well in any circumstance. And despite that, these schools remain the most popular in the city. On the other hand, there is evidence on small high schools, small, generally non-selective, non-screened high schools, that's much more positive for students who are generally lower performing coming into school. So in terms of outcomes, I think we just don't know much. One thing we can point to, though, is segregation. You alluded to this in the introduction, and Lynn did as well, is that we have a system that's very highly segregated, not only by race and ethnicity, but even more so by academic proficiency. And so in the many years that I've studied school choice in New York City, I can consistently point to test scores and grades as one of the strongest predictors of who gets what in the city, whether it's middle school access, high school admissions. And that's not a controversial thing to say. The system is set up that way. Hundreds of schools are screening and actively ranking students based on test scores and grades. And so naturally, we'd expect that to lead to a lot of segregation by student achievement.
Boy, Sean, there's just so much in your answer that I want to dig into, and so thank you for such a thorough answer. We're going to come back to this question of whether or not screens actually serve to retain the middle class by looking at District 15, which, as we've mentioned, got rid of their screens. So I'm going to come back to that in a second. I want to go to Lynn on one very particular point, Lynn, and just on this specific one, because I'm going to come back to the other topics. And that is, Dr. Corcoran mentioned that the screening process is essentially like tracking, but tracking among schools instead of within a school. And so, Lynn, as a teacher, can you talk to us a little bit pedagogically about benefits and drawbacks to having a more homogeneous group of students where you have a bunch of students performing at the same level, or having a broad academic diversity of students, Lynn, in a classroom? Just talk to us pedagogically speaking about benefits and drawbacks of those two things.
Sure. I think you cut out for a split second, but you were saying benefits and drawbacks to diverse classrooms.
Diverse classrooms versus more homogeneous classrooms, like
Okay.
the type that screens might produce.
Right. So I will start by saying that I don't believe that our education system is preparing students for the real global crises that are ahead of us, as evidenced by our response to COVID-19, or massive failed response to COVID-19. And we have this big thing called the climate crisis ahead of us. And I mean, we're already seeing the impacts. And I don't believe that the curriculum, because I do believe curriculum informs pedagogy, and our pedagogy are preparing students to think critically about how to address those problems, because we're planning backwards from these state tests, right? And these state tests, I don't want to go too deep into state tests, but when our classrooms are diverse, our conversations are always so much more dynamic. And we see this, there's so much evidence of this in the workplace too. You have diversity and you get more creativity. And I see that as a teacher. And I don't want to use state test performance as a measure of value, because it really does contradict what I believe is going to empower our youth to really build a better humanity and to save this planet. So it's hard for me to even fathom arguing any sort of benefits for homogeneous classrooms, other than from the teacher standpoint, it discourages us from being very critical about our curriculum and our pedagogy. And so I need that constant pressure to respond, and that diversity gives me that challenge. And I think that we should all be in that position if we really want to be prepared for the problems that are ahead.
That's really great. So Brandon, I'm going to come to you on something else that Dr. Corcoran said. So he mentioned there's a lot of segregation in the system. I didn't hear him, and we can come back to you, Dr. Corcoran. I didn't hear him explicitly say that the screens were the root cause of that segregation, but I'll come back to you, Sean, in a second. Brandon, folks talk about the discriminatory effects of screens. Some people believe it, some people don't. What is your take? Are screens discriminatory just at face value?
I believe so. I think there are certain screens that serve a purpose, like for example, the EdOps system that Nadia was talking about earlier serves a purpose and is kind of what my school is doing, which is very diverse. But I think as a whole, and in our system as a whole, screens are definitely a major problem, especially when you look at the high school level. Because I think one of the major things that people say and what people blame instead of the screens is housing. And so people will say, oh, it's the housing's fault. You know, we have very segregated housing, you know. We don't have a lot of diversity in housing. But the thing is, they're students, many students, and it's not like outliers. Many students are traveling 30 minutes, traveling on the train. They're traveling from Brooklyn to Manhattan. They're traveling from Staten Island to Brooklyn. They're traveling all around our 5 boroughs to get to school and taking 30-minute hour train rides to get to the school that they want to get to, especially when it comes to those screen schools. And so it has nothing to really do with housing. So I mean, if you just look at the 30 most screen schools in our system, only 1/3 of them are Black and Latinx. Only 40% of them are lower income, compared to 2/3 of our whole school system being Black and Latinx, and 75% being lower income. And you can even just look at, if you pinpoint on certain schools. So if you look at, for example, the Beacon, which is only 20% lower income, which is drastically different than 75%, which is our school system as a whole. Or you look at the 14 Black students who go to Eleanor Roosevelt, one of which being there's only one Black student in one of the grades, in 10th grade, I'm almost positive it is now. And that member, she's actually a member of Teen Sick Charge, and she's talked about a lot of the racial problems that she's having in school. And just looking at all the schools as a whole, like we have a lot of racial issues, and obviously they're boiling up now, but we have a lot of racial issues that start and originate in our school system, especially in a school system where everyone's voice is not heard because there's a huge majority, which many times isn't even the majority of the city.
Thank you for that thorough answer. Dr. Corcoran, we'll come back to you because I heard you say, folks who are sort of inherently advantaged tend to see, advantages in the system. Are screens a driver, or are screens inherently discriminatory in New York City, and are they a driver of segregation in New York City?
They're definitely a driver of segregation. I think inherently discriminatory is a much harder question to answer that I'm not equipped to tackle. I would totally agree with Brandon that segregation in New York City is not due to housing or residential segregation. There is a lot of that separately going on in New York City, but the city is extremely compact. It has great public transportation. Students travel everywhere throughout the city to get to school. And so it's not the same explanation that you see in a lot of cities, which is it's all about where people live. Screens and the specialized high school exam, which is required for admission to the most elite high schools in the city, are definitely the proximate cause for segregation. It's just true that there's a large achievement gap between white and Asian students on the one hand and Black and Latinx students on the other. And so when they get to that point of screening, they systematically are going to lose out under that system. And so we can address this issue in a lot of different ways. And one is going further back and narrowing those achievement gaps before students reach that point. But there's also no reason to say that the way that we screen now or the way that we do admissions to specialized high schools is the absolute right way to do it. There could be other ways to go about that are have a much lower disparate impact.
Excellent. Okay, now let's get to the question that everybody's been waiting for from you all. So I want to frame a little bit of something for our audience. Most folks know, but not everybody does. New York State canceled its state testing for this year due to COVID. So one of the major criteria that Nadia Chadha spoke about regarding what schools use to screen is out of the window. Attendance records, COVID has essentially nullified those. That's out the window. Grades, students stopped attending school in late March. So that is questionable. You could potentially use them for the first half of the year. The $1 million question that we want our panelists to answer, because we want to get to some concrete solutions, is I'm going to magically appoint you as the direct advisor to Mayor de Blasio and to the chancellor. And I want you in as succinctly as you can to say given all the information you have, what should be done for next year, the next admission cycle in terms of screens in New York City. Now, I've worked for the chancellor. He likes his information straight and he likes it short and concise. So let's keep to that. And since Sean, you just spoke, why don't we actually start with, I'm gonna start with Brandon, I'll go to Lynn, and then I'll come back to you, Sean. So advise us, what do we do for next year?
I would recommend using an educational option system for all schools that is based off of reading level tests that are administered in elementary school and middle school. And so that basically, as Nadia was talking about earlier, it would create a bell curve and allow a much more diverse pool of applicants to be able to get into the school, and not just looking at racially diverse, but also looking at socioeconomically diverse and academically diverse. Quickly just addressing the fact that a lot of people question if that's possible, or like what the DOE is. Oh wait, I completely blanked on what I was going to say. I'm sorry. I would suggest using an educational option system, and there are over 200 schools that are currently educational option. And so they're already going to have to figure out a system in which place, how they're going to, judge what they're going to use to be judged for the applicants who are applying to those schools. So I don't see why the rest of the schools can't just be sorted in that way too. to say it
Okay,
short.
all right. So we've got your proposal here. So Lynn, you're advising the mayor and the chancellor. What do they do for next year, given where we are?
Given where we are today with the amount of racial violence that we're seeing, I want to connect a direct line from the racial violence to our education system and the cultivation of these deeply internalized biases, that we get to the root cause. And that root cause is that our children are racially segregated, and that feeds these biases that ultimately can lead to violence. So we cannot actually exist in racial isolation in order to address the biggest problems facing our young generation. They have the climate crisis ahead. I always go back to that as the example because we really need our young people to work together and live in a shared humanity, to learn alongside each other, learn from each other, work through that racial tension from a young age so it doesn't manifest in violence. I would highly advise that we remove entirely admission screening because it's obviously segregating our schools.
Okay, so from Brandon, we heard use an EdOpt model. From Lynn, we're hearing just get rid of screens for next year. Sean, I'm interested to hear what your advice to the mayor and the chancellor is for next year.
Thanks. I'll try to be concise. So I'd love to see the city use the coming year as a transitional period to a new model for screened high school admissions. And the approach taken should recognize the complexity of the problem and legitimate competing interests on many sides of the issue. So specifically, I think the DOE should give schools an option of eliminating screens this year. It's not unprecedented. I think many screen programs would voluntarily do that. And for those that don't, a more open and transparent tool for assessing students' fit with selective programs. And there's a lot of ways to construct that. But what I would not like to see is a continuation of the way things have been done in the past, which I think is especially incompatible with public education during a pandemic that's had disparate effects on different communities. So the way the system now, just to say really quickly, is that every screen school ranks students in a manner that they see fit. So they quite literally choose their students. They do provide information about what they use, grades, test scores, et cetera. But at the end of the day, they rank students how they like. There's not much transparency, and prior efforts to obtain the rubrics for screening have not panned out. So the DOE could take a positive step towards providing a more transparent system. This might look something like a composite score or some sort of crude indicator of sort of where students stand coming into high school. They would be open, transparent, easy for families, but also workable for schools.
Okay, I mean, you did a pretty good job given how complex that plan is. So not too bad there, Dr. Corcoran.
Thanks.
So I'm going to do two things, and then we're going to actually open it up for the audience Q&A. So one of the things I want to do is we're going to go back to our DOE representative, Ms. Chada here, to tell us a little bit about District 15. It's come up a number of times. And last year, District 15 eliminated its screens for its middle schools. And so we just want a little bit of some data, some facts. Can you, Nadia, give us a before and after picture and tell us precisely what did it look like in D15 before in relation to admissions? What does it look like now? And what have the effects been as a result of that?
Sure. So in District 15, the community came up with a plan there to not only unscreen all of their middle schools, their 11 middle schools, but also to add in a priority, one that I was talking about before, for students who are low income English language learners or in temporary housing. And the goal was to make sure that every middle school represents more of the entire population of District 15, so that every school would become more diverse, more representative. And so what we saw was before the plan, only 4 of the 11 middle schools were within a target range of this representation of students. After the plan, 9 of the 11 schools fell within the target range. And that was in the first year of the change. This year, which was their second admission cycle with this change, 8 schools fell within the target range. So you can see that it seems like the trends are longer lasting than at least 1 year. And we also didn't see that there was huge shifts in students or families leaving the district. We see pretty much the same percentage of students actually enrolling from offers to enrollment than we have in the past.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that was exactly what I was hoping to get to, because Dr. Corcoran at the beginning mentioned a rationale given for screens is often to keep the middle class in schools. And what we're hearing from you is that there was no substantial shift in enrollment patterns from one year to the next. And what we're also hearing is that schools got substantially more diverse just in the course of 1 year because of this change. So that's helpful, because this is a New York City district that has undergone the type of change that I think Lynn, you were advocating for, and perhaps because you work in District 15, that might inform some of your views on that. I want to ask one more question myself, and then I'm going to get to the audience Q&A. We're going to actually turn to a colleague of mine at the Century Foundation, Hallie Potter, to read selected Q&A. The last question I have that's coming from me, Dr. Corcoran, I want to put this in slightly of a bigger context here. So we've got New York City. I know when I got to New York City, I was quite surprised at how many screen schools there were. I mean, we heard Nadia tell us about a third of middle or high schools could be considered screen schools. What does that look like in comparison to other large districts across the country? Is New York an anomaly, or is this sort of the standard practice across the country?
Well, New York stands out for a lot of reasons. It's just a gigantic school district with 1.1 million students and several thousand schools. So there are many large cities that have selective high schools. And so Chicago comes to mind, Boston, Philadelphia, DC, even Nashville, where I live, has a very highly selective public high school. And so you can't find a city that has as many screen schools as New York City, but then again, you can't find a city that has as many schools as New York City. And so I'm not quite certain that New York City screens at a greater rate than other districts, but everything is bigger in New York City and more complex. But going back to something we talked about earlier, which is that screening is another term that's used for tracking, but it's between schools rather than within schools. And so there are many, many more examples of G&T programs around the country, honors tracks. Everybody's familiar with this kind of screening of students. And so it's quite common. In terms of like similarities and differences, one similarity that you find with other large cities is that you see the same kind of bifurcated system that you see in New York City, a sort of tale of two school districts where high achieving students have some opportunities to attend schools that lower achieving students don't. One difference that you see between New York City and other places, I think, is that in other cities, the criteria for admission is a lot more uniform. And so it's pretty clear what it takes to get to a selective school in other cities. In New York, it's really up to individual schools to provide these rankings, which creates just a lot more complexity for parents and for schools.
So you just brought up something at the end that I've heard, a concern I've heard from a lot of New York City parents, which is there's not tons of transparency for some of these screen schools. They're not, all schools are not publishing the rubrics that they use to admit students. And I know that that's of concern. Sean, I just wanted to follow up on one thing. So I understand that New York City is larger than other school districts. So by the numbers, it may have more screen schools. But like we said, we have about a third of those schools that are screened. Putting aside internal tracking for a second, is that higher by percentage than most urban districts, or is it lower? Just the screening among schools, not within school within school tracking.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that in terms of the fraction of schools that screen is higher in New York City than in other cities.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to go now to audience Q&A, so I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Hallie Potter to ask the first question.
Great. The first question from the audience that I want to bring to the panelists is there any evidence that students are academically benefited by screen schools? In other words, do kids with the same entering scores do better at screen schools than at non-screen schools? Or are screen schools just segregating students based on prior performance without actually increasing their learning?
Thank you, Hallie. So I know Sean mentioned this at the beginning in relation to specialized schools, but does anyone want to take a stab at this question that Hallie just posed?
I can speak from the classroom perspective. I have taught homogeneous, G&T classes, and I've taught extremely diverse ICT classes, E&L classes, and we have to reckon with the fact that the achievement standards are labeling children as less capable or more capable, when as a teacher, it's very clear to me that there is not, that relationship lacks integrity. So if a child cannot speak English because they're new to this country, it does not mean that they don't have the means to think critically and contribute in a dynamic classroom environment. So it's really hard to step away from that. But when we step away from the data that we're using to label children as able or disabled, that everything kind of falls apart.
Thanks. Did anybody else want to get in on that one before we go to the next audience Q&A?
I'll just say briefly, because the question was kind of about the research, is that the research is really mixed on this question. And I think there are high impact screen schools and there are very low impact screen schools that really are just taking students that would do well in any school and not necessarily having any value added for those students. I mean, ironically, there is some research that finds that some of the students that benefit most from these programs are sort of middle achieving students that are sort of on the cusp, who are more disadvantaged, who have other educational disadvantages that gain admission to this type of a program. So it's not something that it's universally beneficial.
Great, thanks for adding that context. Why don't we go to the next audience Q&A? Hallie.
Great. I'm going to combine two questions here that are both about whether we're kind of talking about the wrong issue. So one question was, shouldn't the mayor use his power of mayoral control to create more screened specialized schools so that they exist throughout the city, including in central Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Harlem? And another question was, are the screens the issue, or is it actually the K-12 education that DOE is offering up to that point?
All right, Brandon, I'd love to have you weigh in on this one. So the first question was, why shouldn't the mayor just use his power to create more screen schools, particularly in geographic areas where they don't exist? So you can either take that one or the second question that Hallie asked as to whether or not we're focusing on the wrong thing and we should be focusing on how DOE is preparing students for their next level of education.
Mm-hmm. I want to start by saying that one of the things I think is not addressed enough is the fact that we're not just looking, well, one, when we look at screen schools, we're not just looking at a group of students who pass the test, we're also looking at those students in those schools getting a lot more resources than the other school. And on top of that, humans are also resources. So having a diverse classroom, because diversity can go both ways. You can have undiverse classrooms that are majority white and Asian, but you can also have them that are majority Black and Latinx. And both of those have very negative sides because they don't interact with each other. We live in New York City. New York City is an extremely diverse place. And every student is going to have to interact with people who don't look like them, who don't think like them, who are not from the same culture as them. And so having those diverse schools that screens oppose and that screens make unavailable, basically, is losing a resource altogether that we could get and that would benefit every single student.
Great. Anybody else want to hop in on either of those? Should the mayor just create more screen schools in places where they don't exist? And the second question, Sean, you look like you want to hop in.
I would say the answer to the first question is no. There are a lot of screened schools already. There's no shortage of screened programs in New York City. And so I think adding more screening is not going to create more diverse schools by any stretch of the imagination. Right now, there's sort of a tiered system of screen schools where there's some very elite, extremely hard to get into high schools. And then there's sort of all of the other screen programs that are, modestly competitive. It's very much like colleges, for example. So I don't see how the first approach is going to do much. And the answer to the second question is, of course, like we definitely need to work on reducing achievement gaps. I mean, this starts as early as pre-K to alleviate this problem so that we don't have to tackle this so late in the game. But at the same time, in New York City is a very transient city, and there's a lot of students that come in, they're immigrants, they're moving from other places. They didn't spend their K-12 career necessarily in New York City. And so it's not a problem that will go away.
All right. Lynn, anything to add, or should we go to the next Q&A from the audience?
Just a question to pose, that, if we create, why are we actually trying to stratify students by ability in the first place if we have evidence that it's not actually, for one, addressing the biggest issues that we're seeing today, but also actually making students more successful in college and careers beyond. And what is the purpose of public education? Like, it's to create opportunities. And by creating more screened schools, we're creating a culture of elitism, and that's automatically going to separate children. So I'm not in favor of adding more screened schools.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that answer. So Hallie, depending on the question, we may have time for one or two more. So let's go to you for the next audience Q&A question.
Great. I'm going to combine two again that are both about the role that geography plays. So one, it says, let's ensure that any conversations or policy decisions that address equity and segregation take geographic admissions priorities into account and not just screening, both of which are historical phenomenon, as Sean has talked about. Why should a young person be excluded from any school on the basis of where he or she lives or goes to school? And on a related issue, someone asked, is there any possibility of New York City schools moving towards accepting equal amounts of students from all parts or boroughs of New York City, similar maybe to how Chicago schools admit students?
Great. Before I go to the panelists, Nadia, I'm going to sort of put you on the spot here. We haven't talked at all about any of the geographic priorities that students get in New York City for certain schools. Can you just give us a quick layperson's understanding for what that looks like in certain middle schools and high schools across the city, and how widespread that practice of, because I live here, I get to go to this school? Just a brief synopsis.
Sure. So at the middle school level, that priority is more widespread. So most kids have a kind of district priority. So if you live in District 15, for instance, or go to school there, you have a priority to attend a District 15 school. And that's kind of reflective of general perception that these kids are younger. It's better to keep them closer to home, or at least give them the opportunity to. At the high school level, however, which is ostensibly citywide, there's still a lot of schools that use geographic priorities, and those can be priorities for Bronx students, priorities for kids from certain districts. The places you see this most are really in District 2 and District 15 high schools. District 2 is Central Manhattan and the Upper East Side. District 15 is kind of like Western Brooklyn. I don't know how you describe it, Lynn, sorry. I'm thinking of neighborhoods. But these areas have a lot of high schools that give a priority to kids who live nearby.
And so real quick, are there some schools that are essentially out of the question if you don't live in the geographic priority where they pull from?
Yes, that is certainly the case in many of these schools.
All right, thank you. So now to our panelists, that question addressing the geographic issue and whether or not a Chicago-like plan could be beneficial in New York City. Sean, your mic is off, so I'll go to you first, but I'll give time for the other panelists to jump in if they have thoughts.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I mean, we definitely need to address these geographic priorities, and most of them are not very well thought through. They're just ad hoc restrictions that have been in place for a long time, and people either want to keep them or get rid of them. And so those need to be rethought. There is a role for geography, I'll just say quickly, which is that, many students are making really long trips to high school, and many students don't do well with those kinds of commutes. And so I think there are some well-intentioned policies that acknowledge that student attendance is better when they're not traipsing, an hour across the city. But that doesn't mean we should cut off access based on geography. In terms of the Chicago system, I'll say that's a nice model to look to for our exam schools, for example, or specialized high schools, because what they do is combine information about student performance on an admissions test with also indicators of neighborhood disadvantage. And so they're sort of operating in a priority type type way to give students who are coming from much more disadvantaged neighborhoods a little bit of a leg up when it comes to admissions. And so those are being used in combination. So I definitely support thinking about those kinds of policies in combination.
Excellent. Lynn or Brandon, you want to weigh in on the geography question?
Yeah, definitely. I think that especially in the high school screen system and in the high school admission system, geography shouldn't really play a part at all, based off what Sean was saying and based off what I also said before, that students are traveling 30 minutes to an hour all the time, taking different subways to get to whatever school they want to. And it's also, I just want to highlight the fact that when you look at like some of the most popular districts that are doing these practices, so for example, District 2, and you look at where they're located, what neighborhoods they choose to cut off, and then also why some of the best schools, for example, Eleanor Roosevelt, which I mentioned earlier, are in those districts. And that in itself is extremely discriminatory. There's a reason that the wealthier neighborhoods in Manhattan are all kind of, if you look at a map of District 2, stretched all the way up Manhattan is District 2. And that there's a reason that all those really well-resourced neighborhoods are in one area. That basically means that they can only go to those schools and other people around them can't. So it's a very like gerrymandered map, just to give a little context. It's a very gerrymandered map. If just looking at it of the different neighborhoods that are in District 2.
Thanks for that, Brandon. That is like frequent criticism we hear when folks just look at the way district boundaries have been drawn. It's clear they've been drawn with the intent to include certain neighborhoods and exclude others. So that's a good point that you bring up. I'm going to, Lynn, so you can wrap this up in your final thoughts if you want. I'm sorry, but I need to move to final closing statements. And this is just 30 seconds to a minute from each panelist, what you want folks to be thinking about moving forward, particularly as it relates to what needs to happen next year. So we'll do concluding thoughts, and we'll do them in the same order that we started. So we're going to start with Sean. We'll go to Brandon, and then we'll come to Lynn, and then I will close this out here.
All right, thanks, Stefan. So I'll just close by saying that, the coronavirus didn't create this debate or this issue. This is something that has been a topic of conversation for decades in New York City. It's definitely been on the front burner of the mayor and the chancellor's dashboard. I guess my closing thought would be is that we should use this as an opportunity to take a step back and really rethink what kind of policy and educational goals we're trying to accomplish with school admissions. This is echoing a little bit of what Lynn had to say. It's not clear to me that our current system of screening before or during the time of coronavirus is the right way to accomplish whatever those goals are. So this is really an opportunity. I think District 15 and the diversity in admissions initiatives provide a great example of how communities come together to talk about what matters to them and how admissions can better reflect those priorities. And so I'm hoping the same thing happens this year.
Thank you, Sean. Brandon.
Yeah, I think the DOE has the chance to abolish many of these discriminatory screens that are causing such a problem. By allowing them to continue, we're defining students based off scores, giving them inflated sense of self-worth or a deflated sense of self-worth. I think one of the things that we didn't really get to cover over this panel based off time restrictions was the fact that screens have a negative aspect. Just looking at like stress and looking at the mental health of students. I know when I talk to certain students who, for example, I have a lot of friends who go to Beacon, the amount of stress that they're under at all times because they go to Beacon and because of like the high intensity environment of that school is detrimental to their mental health. And I think it goes the other way around. And in a school system where we already are lacking guidance counselors, we're lacking people to help students with their mental health in the school environment. I think that screens would be a really good way to allow people to, one, feel very less stressed, but also be able to interact with beliefs that they may not agree with. Like, for example, in Murrow, I've had to meet people who don't have the same political ideas as me, and I've had to really have a conversation with them and actually understand where they're coming from to be able to have that conversation. People who don't look like us, and again, cultures that are not ours. Currently, our school system perpetuates the wealth gap, and it stops generational wealth from being created in lower class neighborhoods by not giving future generations the tools to succeed. And the mayor and the DOE can easily fix this problem if they just stop being so stressed by these small groups of parents that feel the need to vocalize super loudly, overbearingly, and like outshout every other group. And actually just listen and look at the statistics and look at the numbers and think about the actual effect that it's having on the majority of students.
Compelling words from a student, Brandon. Been really impressed with your participation in the panel today. Thank you. Final statement from Lynn.
I first want to shout out Brandon too. I'm blown away because when I was your age, I couldn't speak to these issues. It's incredible. I'm proud. I'm not your teacher, but you're amazing. I want to echo both what Brandon and Sean both said about taking the opportunity to really critically examine screening and its impacts, and how the impact of racial segregation is really cultivating a generation that can perpetuate and uphold violence, racialized violence as well. And I think that we could be trapped. We have an opportunity to free ourselves from this vicious cycle, because we are all products. Many of us are products of racial segregation, and we live in these racially isolated circles. And so as Brandon mentioned, these parents who can be very vocal, their perspectives are really limited. And we have to fight that and invest in what the teachers and the students, and the data is showing that the racial diversity really can make us not just more intelligent, but better people and better equipped to address racial violence, but also a global pandemic, climate crisis, all of the above.
Wow. Well, what a positive note to end on. I want to thank all of you for your great comments. It has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you all for attending today's webinar, which was presented by the Century Foundation's Bridges Collaborative. A recording of this will be made available on our website, tcf.org, within 48 hours. And for more information on upcoming events on our work, please visit tcf.org. Lastly, please stay safe, exercise your First Amendment rights, and use the events of the moment to interrogate this nation's history, its treatment of its citizens, and your role in making our country a better place for our children. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.